Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's episode with Matthew Cruz. So, Matthew has been struggling with addiction since a young age, and as you all already know, I can very much relate to this. And by chance, he came across the carnivore diet, and I think that it would be fair to say that it has turned everything around almost. So, I thought he would be a really interesting guest to have on. Welcome to the show, Matthew.
Thank you very much. I'm really glad to be here.
Awesome. So I can remember when I was about 5, 6 years old, maybe, and I was up early in the morning. My mom is one of those people, she just sleeps in, and I would just get a chair out and I would climb up into the cupboards and I would look in the corner where I knew that she was hiding the cookies, and then I would steal
Oh,
one or two. And
yeah.
I knew that
Okay.
she hid them there because
Yeah.
she knew that if she wasn't, I would either eat them all or I would nag her
hmm
all day to give me the cookies. So I'm just
hmm
wondering, like, do you have this experience as well from a very young age? Do you have certain memories where how it began? Things that you don't necessarily want to tell your mom.
Oh, yeah. Well, it's funny as you're telling that story. I'm like, oh my gosh, man, how old was I? I think it was 8 at the time,
Hmm.
and my parents were going to be hosting this party. And a few days beforehand, my mom had done a ton of baking, and she made a lot of cookies, and she had this huge bucket of cookies. And she had it in the freezer, like we had a big chest freezer, and she had it underneath a bunch of stuff
Yeah.
so that like I couldn't find it. But I did. And I think like for like 2 days, like every 30 minutes, like every hour, I would go and like take another cookie and eat it. And when my mom pulled them out before the party, I think half of that bucket was gone. So we're talking like 30 cookies. Um, and yeah, I mean, that's just like the first example that comes to mind, but
Hmm.
so many times just sneaking treats, sneaking another bowl of cereal. I never like hoarded food where I would like get food and then like hide it because I didn't need to. So there's always access to it. But yeah, definitely that behavior of sneaking food and feeling shame around eating, that's a huge problem.
Yeah.
So yeah, a lot of my growing up is that story on repeat, just like swap out different foods. Yeah.
What did she say when she opened the container?
Oh, she was upset, which was rightly so. Um, I'm pretty sure I got spanked, which was very justified. Um, but it's interesting because she didn't like shame me
Yeah.
about it. It's one of those things where my dad was exceptionally overweight, and he was dealing with a whole bunch of trauma from growing up. And so the fact that he was a functioning human being is a miracle. He has bipolar, and so anyone who's grown up with a bipolar parent knows that's a very uh, emotionally dynamic situation. It's kind
Hmm.
of the nice way to say that.
Yeah.
And and um, very early on, well, and the way he dealt with it was with food. And so he would constantly be managing his feelings with just eating food. And so
Mm.
I think like growing up, the lightest he ever was 350 pounds and on a 5'11" frame. And I think the biggest he ever got was like 450, 460.
Wow.
Yeah. So big dude. And so like that was like normal for our family.
Mm.
So there was never like a fat shaming that went on. It was so when my mom sees this, she's just like, Matthew, just like, why'd you do that? And I got in trouble. But it wasn't like, hey, we have a problem here. Like your eating is out of control, because that was normal for the family. And a lot of my extended family is from the Midwest, Missouri. And if you're from the United States or ever visited there, and you know that the Midwest has a lot of very large people in it.
Yeah.
And so that was normal. So the fact that I was clearly dealing with a food addiction uh, was, it wasn't weird, because like everyone was dealing with it. That was home. That was what life was like.
Interesting. for me, it was totally different. I think my mom would always
Mm,
say to me, "Why do you have to eat all the time?"
mm,
Well, I don't know. I'm hungry.
mm,
I don't know, but it wasn't in a
mm,
shameful way. So I don't think for me it was never about shame. It was just like, well, I'm
mm,
hungry. I'm gonna eat.
mm.
I didn't really realize that I was always hungry for sugar, not necessarily,
Yeah,
food.
yeah.
So you mentioned that your father and the whole way your family was looking at things was that this
Mhm,
is kind of how we are. This is normal in
mhm,
this family at least, and it's probably
mhm,
normal in the area where you are. And
mhm,
that might have been the start of your food addictions, but I know that you have
mm,
other addictions as well. So
mhm.
where do you think that these came from? What's going on here?
Man, so great question. And feel free to cut me off if I'm like, wow, you're going like really too deep on stuff. But
Would be
when I
great.
started when oh yeah, great. So when I started getting into recovery, right? And we started like unpacking these things. One of the most universal things about people's stories when they are struggling with addiction is that they there's some event, there's something that happens uh, in your growing up where you learn that you you're on your own, and it's not always okay to talk about how you feel, or like the way you feel is illegitimate or something like that. And so you learn to bottle that up. But the reality is like those feelings are still there, and you're just kind of compressing them down. And so what ends up happening is like you need to deal with them. And one of the things that we talk about in recovery is like addiction almost always, I'm an engineer, so I like to be very precise in my language, but it's almost always you have a legitimate need that you're meeting in an illegitimate way. And so when you're not having like your emotional needs met as a child, you're growing up, there's a need for a feeling of security, of being loved and being accepted. And you're not getting that, like that manifests itself in other ways. And so in my life, there was very clearly early on, there was a food addiction that quickly developed. And so I would feel bad. Something would happen, right? Some emotionally charged thing happened at home, right? And I'm like, I feel bad right now. I can't share it with my family because that's where it's coming from.
Mm.
But I still have a need to like deal with this feeling. And so the easiest way to deal with it that I learned very on is like you bury that with sugar. Like you bury that with food. And for me, it wasn't always sugar. It was, very often pizza, carbs, very carby food. So things that kind of give you that I believe it's a dopamine hit from having lots of carbs, right? Pizza is a classic. Pizza is like
Yeah.
a perfect storm because you got bread, you got tomato paste, and you got cheese. And often if you get something like with like greasy pepperoni or something, I mean, it's just, it's a total garbage fire. Like you're doomed.
Yeah.
So that for me was one of my big hits. And so very early on, I learned to deal with those feelings, of that feeling of insecurity by eating. And then once I got older and started to go through puberty, I discovered masturbation. And I know people are all over the spectrum on this. I'm a Christian. So for me, um, let's talk about what is, when you say addiction, what do you mean? I think an addiction is something where if there's something in your life that is out of control and is damaging or limiting your ability to have quality relationships with other people, you have a serious problem. Like we don't even have to call it an addiction, right? So I'm growing up in this Christian household, very strict and stuff, like, oh, that's bad. I'm like, oh, so I feel terrible, but it is giving me emotional relief. And
Mm.
so I quickly become addicted to that as a means of coping with my feelings. So at my house, I didn't have access to pornography at the time. A few years later, I go to college and there's internet at the college. And so I quickly become addicted to pornography. And so it's one of those things where emotional situations and stuff happen. And this is how I've learned to deal with these feelings because I don't know how have really quality relationships and deal with those feelings in a really healthy way. So college, heavily addicted to pornography, every other day, 2 to 3 hours of binging on pornography. The food got a little bit better because I had a stronger thing to deal with those emotions.
Mm.
So that goes on for, I'm getting so old now. I get time dilation, just like, oh man, when did stuff happen? It's like, no, it's like 20 years ago now, dude. Like, oh my gosh. But so that goes on for really badly for about 9 years, and I finally start to recover from it. And I think one of the things that helped me to deal with that is learning to have quality relationships with guys and being able to be open about like, hey, I am struggling with this. I don't want to do this. I feel incapable of stopping. Will you help me? And again, one of the things in recovery that we talk about, like, the opposite of addiction is not sobriety, it's community, right? Because it's always that need for connect. It's often that need for connection and feeling close to people and feeling known and loved and accepted that you're missing. And this is how you're often dealing with it. Not always the case. There are things like, methamphetamines or something that there's more chemical things going on. But so that's what I'm struggling with at that point. And I'm going to have to go through the details later on, get married. And even that, I was very open with my wife about the things that I struggled with at that point. So the food had gotten a lot better, again, because I have a different thing to deal with. Meet my wife, but at the time I'm working a full-time job. I just got married. I'm working on a master's degree, and so the stress starts to build up again. And I don't know how to deal with it in a really healthy way. So I start looking at pornography again. I'm very open with my wife. I say like, hey, I got a problem. And I start meeting with the men's group about, dealing with recovery. And that's where I start kind of unpacking these things like, oh my gosh, so that was very helpful and helped me kind of understand like, hey, what's going on in your head when like you're wanting to go to food, you're wanting to go to pornography. So I start to get that. Doesn't take it all away. Like it's a much healthier way of dealing with it, but like still the temptation, the noise from that is still, it's like not a 9 anymore, but it's still a really solid 5. Yeah. This goes on for a while. Again, emotional healing and stuff going on. Great. Eventually my wife and I have our first child. Let's talk about stress.
Yeah, can imagine.
No, so little sleep. My job is very stressful, so I start drinking, and it was like, it's one glass of wine, right? Okay, now it's 2 glasses of wine. Okay, now it's bourbon. Okay, now it's like 2 glasses of bourbon, and that quickly starts to escalate. And so here I am struggling with all these things, I'm trying to keep the timeline together. So this whole time I'm still struggling with my weight. Like I'm like keeping the weight off-ish, and the way I lost it initially was doing and this was like back in high school. So my heaviest in high school I got to was 265 pounds on a 5'6" frame. So that gives you a 48-inch waist. My apologies for the internationals. I'm in the US. My bad. Yeah, my bad. It's really big. It's really big. A really big dude. I lost a lot of that by just eating less, exercising more. And that works when you're in your teens, right? Because you still have a lot of vitality. Fast forward to when I'm 30 and I have a child and I'm stressed and I'm gaining weight again. Even though I was doing keto at the time, because I'd always been in the search for like, how do I like maintain my weight without getting really heavy? I mean, without having to restrict myself. it wasn't really doing anything for me. I mean, I was maintaining weight, but I definitely wasn't losing weight. So at the time I heard a podcast, Two Keto Dudes with Amber O'Hearn. And Amber talked about the carnivore diet. I'm like, oh, this is really interesting. Meanwhile, all this like alcohol, pornography, struggle occasionally, weight's kind of going up. Like, so like there's a whole mess here. And I'm still meeting with guys and like emotional recovery, but like things are not great. So I find out about the carnivore diet. I'm like, that sounds crazy, but purely from a, I want to lose weight standpoint, like I think I could do that. And it sounds delicious. So I changed jobs. I moved to Detroit. I moved to Detroit, Michigan, before my family. And I have this 2-month period where I'm there by myself. My family's still back here back in Portland, Oregon. So I'm like, I'm going to give this carnivore thing a try. I'm going to go all in. And I'm just doing New York strip steak and eggs and bacon and black coffee. And which was delicious. I'm like, oh, I'm losing weight. This is fantastic. Yay. What for me was even more remarkable. I talked about like that noise level of temptation and wanting to medicate myself with, pornography or food or alcohol. That noise level, that temptation started to go down. I'm like, what is going on? What is going on? Because yeah, before it was like loud every day and it was just like gritting my teeth to get through it. Meeting with a group of people brought that down to a 5. Going carnivore brought that down to like a 1. And I'm like, what is happening here? Because I'm there, I'm by myself. I have an apartment. I'm the only one there. I have access. I have internet access. I can go to the liquor store anytime. I have absolutely unlimited access to all the things that would normally be severe temptations for me.
Yeah.
And it's still a stressful time in my life because my family is back here. We had just had our second child. And so my wife is being a single mom with them. We're trying to sell our house there. We're trying to buy a house here, brand new job. So like, this is a stressful time. So it's not like the stress just dropped out of my life. I'm like, oh, the reason you got better is because everything was easy. I'm like, no, no. So going carnivore and going pure carnivore made that noise level just completely drop down. I just stopped drinking bourbon. Like I had some and I was like, you know what, this doesn't even taste good anymore. I don't even want this. And just walked away from it. I'm like, what? That's crazy. And again, I am alone with access to the internet and highly stressful. I'm like, I don't even want to do that. What happened? And it's not like I'm there with my wife because again, someone can make the excuse like, oh, well, you're married and so you're getting all your physical needs met. I'm like, no, like the opposite of that is happening. Yeah. And it's like, that's like, again, that noise level has like dropped down to 1. And I'm like, this is crazy. What is going on in my head? And so that's when I started digging in, like, what is it about the carnivore diet? And I know there's almost no research on a carnivore diet. So hats off to Sean Baker and all those people like starting that process. Cause we need some good studies to show the efficacy of it. But I'm just telling you from an anecdotal standpoint, like, oh my gosh, that noise level went way down. And I think this is really interesting. So when COVID-19 hit, I was doing carnivore, things were good. COVID-19 hits, Costco runs out of beef. Like there's no beef around me, right? I'm like, huh. And like, that was the primary thing I was eating. Like it was pretty much just beef, steak, ground beef, and eggs. Beef's all gone. I was like, huh. And so because the world was in such a cluster, I was like, you know what? F it. Just F it. Like once it comes back, I can go back on carnivore, super easy. So I went off carnivore for a while. Like that noise level of like, oh my gosh, I need a drink. I need a drink. I need a drink. went way up. That need to like, hey, I just want to like check out from reality and go browse the internet and just entertain myself and just like go numb. That desire came rushing back up. And now I don't have community because we're all shut in our houses, right? So it's not like I'm able to like go and connect with some of my friends and talk about, you know, life. Like we had some Zoom meetings and stuff, but it's not the same. Oh my gosh. Got a little ugly. And again, I was very open with my wife, and we're like, hey, we need to figure out how to be healthy as a family. Cause she was struggling with some other stuff just related to being isolated for so long with 2 little kids. So like, man, we got to figure this out. And I'm like, babe, I got to go back on carnivore. I gotta go stick to it. And so this last week went back strict carnivore. Whew, the noise level came right back down. So it's just like, I don't even want the alcohol. I don't even want to go on the internet. And it's just like, for me, like there's clearly something going on. The interaction between, you know, what you eat affecting your mental state, which then affects like how you react to situations, which can then snowball. Because if I feel bad and then I'm short with my kids and then they start crying and I get more frustrated, and then it's like, hey, this sucks. I hate this. I'm just stressed out. I just want to escape. And then like, do I escape to a bottle? Do I escape to the internet? Do I escape to food? That again, just completely snowballs. But it's just like, hey, no, I'm just going to feed myself something that I know is not going to disrupt my mental state. It's going to put me in the best possible mental state. All those things get easier. And the probability of those things snowballing into something else goes way down. And so now what I find really interesting is like, hey, I've done this like twice now. So it wasn't like the first time was just like a fluke, like, oh, you were just riding like, you know, the honeymoon phase of carnivore. Or like, I'm on Instagram, I'm on Twitter, and all the carnivores are like, this is awesome. This is awesome. I'm like, yeah, this is awesome. Because everyone says it's awesome and I want to feel like a part of the carnivore group. I actually pretty much dropped off of social media. I mean, I still have a Twitter in case, you know, people reach out to me because I want to be available there if people have questions. But the first time it happens, someone could say like, well, you're just kind of the honeymoon phase of a diet and it's doing great things for you. Like I've done this twice now where I've gone like poorer eating, carnivore, felt so much better. Went off of carnivore, felt terrible. Addiction, temptation goes up. Go back on carnivore, it goes back down again. I'm like, this is a big deal. And my wife pointed it out as well a couple of days ago, where typically by late afternoon after we've been dealing with the kids all day, and my kids are wonderful, don't get me wrong, but like
the kids,
you kind of, sometimes you just want a break as a parent, right? And so 4 p.m. rolls around and this day I was just super mellow, right? Wasn't frustrated with the kids. She's like, you're like way more chill today. And I'm like, huh, that's really interesting. And so that if anybody comes to me and says like, hey, Matthew, I'm struggling with addiction or something, like, hey, man, most important thing, you need to be in community. You need to be connecting with people because you cannot heal from that stuff in isolation. But one of the things I'm also excited about and talking to people about is like, hey, we know that what you take into your body affects your mental state.
Yes.
I'm tired. You drink coffee, you feel more awake. You took something in, your mental state was affected, right? You get hungry, you get cranky, you eat something, you're no longer cranky. Your mental state is affected by what you ingest. Like we intuitively know this. Wouldn't it make sense then that certain foods are going to have more beneficial effects for your mind than others? And wouldn't it make sense that there are some foods that cause negative effects on your mental state? Looking at you, sugar. And again, this stuff just seems intuitively obvious, but for me, I didn't even think about it. Just like how can my my mental state and my struggle with addiction be impacted by what I eat? Like, it's just like, I never made that connection, but it seems, how could it not be the case? Because you're a whole human being. Like, so anything that affects one part is going to affect all of the parts. Sorry, I've been going for a long time.
Yeah, I've got a few questions with regards to
Yeah.
what you were saying. I'll start at the end. So why do you think that it is that the carnivore diet affects you so in such a positive direction, even if it's not getting rid of it completely, is making a huge difference?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And what I think is going on is that when you are giving your body everything it needs nutritionally, and you're removing everything that could be irritating it, you're putting your body in its happiest possible state, right? That's a very simplistic way of saying that. But like, you feel as good as you possibly can physically. And that means when you go through the rest of your day, when I go through the rest of my day, I feel good. I don't feel hungry. I feel incredibly satisfied. And so those other things that would frustrate me or cause me to be irked do not affect me as much. So it's one of those things where, like, if you make something so much easier, if you make one part of your life much easier,
Yeah,
you have much more capacity to deal with the other things that are frustrating or inconvenient in your life. So I think that's one component of it. I know that I am very strongly affected by sugar. Like when I have it, I like feel like I'll tell my wife, like, I feel my joints getting tighter. Like it's like, so if I have pizza, I feel myself like tightening and like my joints starting to swell. And just like, I know that this is, and so I just feel worse as a person, just like in my own body. And so putting my body in a state where it feels as good as it possibly can makes everything else so much easier.
do you buy into the idea that it could be like a brain chemical imbalance as well, and that, you know, when you're eating a lot of meat, you get all the amino acids that you need? Do you think that could be part of it, or do you not buy into that at all?
I absolutely think that's the case. I absolutely think that's the case. And I'm not a neurobiologist or something who kind of deeply understands that. But again, clearly we know that, like take alcohol, for example, like alcohol goes across the blood-brain barrier, the barrier into your brain, which is why you get buzzed. So clearly those things are having an effect on your mental state. So I think that absolutely that is the case. And so when we see people struggling with addiction, there's often some hormonal chemical imbalance going on, right? And so when you're providing your body all the nutrition that it needs, it's able to fix that stuff. So I absolutely think that is the case of what's going on.
Interesting. So I was thinking about, because you said you were keto before, and clearly that didn't impact you the same way, but I'm just assuming that you were still eating quite a lot of meat. So do you think that the problem there might have been the vegetables for you personally, or what didn't
Yeah,
it work?
I think that is absolutely part of what's going on. I think that their plants don't like to get eaten. Right. So like, yeah, it's just like plants would have lived too. And us eating plants, unless it's like fruit, right? Fruit makes sense. It's like, hey, the plant's making fruit. It has a pit or it has seeds and it wants some other animal to kind of eat it and spread seeds and move them around. Totally makes sense. But the rest of the plant wasn't really meant to be eaten. And so when we look at all the chemicals of like what's going on in those plants and like the chemicals they have to fight insects Like that is their defense mechanism, is they're producing chemicals that are antagonistic to the things that eat them, right? Now, typically those things are meant to fight off bugs or other smaller animals, right? We are big enough. We are big enough that we can take some of that in, and we have just enough mass that we can kind of buffer ourselves against it. Like, hey, I could take a little bit of this, and like, it's irritating, but I'm just so much bigger than the plant that you're not going to be able to take me out. You're going to irritate me, but you can't take me out. And what we've seen happen, though, is that the proportion of our diet that's made up of plants, well, you know, classic North American diet, the SAD diet, the proportion of your diet that is made up of plants, so the thing that does not want to be eaten, is a really high percentage. And so wouldn't it make sense that, hey, you're eating a lot of a thing, specifically a part of a thing that doesn't want to be eaten? And yeah, the human body is extraordinarily resilient. Like you could throw a whole bunch of terrible stuff at it and it's going to keep running because your body's number one goal is survival. Right. So it is going to find out a way, but survival is very different than thriving. And I think that it's interesting because for a lot of human history, it was just about what's available to eat. It had much less to do with like what's ideal to eat. And like, it doesn't matter what's ideal. This is what we got. And so that's what you're going to do. Yeah. We're now at the place where we are so efficient as a species at manufacturing food that we can make terrible things at scale. And one of the other things that kind of helped me kind of realize like, wow, maybe all these manufactured foods aren't so good, is if you think about it, packaged foods is an industry. They are there to make money, right? So what they are trying to do is design food that maximizes the amount that you want and how much you can eat, right? And so you do that by adding sugar, by adding salt, by adding fat. So it sends signals to your body to say like, oh my gosh, this is good, I want more of it. And also suppresses that feeling of satiety. Yeah. Right. So like, it's not, so stuff that comes in a box, that's not food. That's a product. And for me, kind of changing my mental state around, I was like, this makes a lot of sense. And it's hilarious because in a previous life, I was a chemical engineer. And so we had the food science people were right next to us on the college campus. And so much of what they did is like, hey, how do we make something taste as good as it possibly can? Yeah. And manufacture it as cheaply as possible. Nowhere in there is human health a consideration.
Sugar and seed oils are.
Oh yeah. Yeah. This stuff's cheap as dirt. And actually probably cheaper because good soil can be expensive. Yeah. So I think that we are only now like really diving into what makes a healthy diet. Like, I'm not the expert on these things, and there's tons of great books out there for people to go dig into, The Big Fat Surprise, Why We Get Fat by Gary Taubes. There's a lot of good resources, right? So those people have done much more research, so I'm going to defer to them. But we do not have nutrition science. Not really. What we have is a bunch of epidemiological studies, which are just correlations. And hopefully everyone has heard correlation is not causation. Again, as like a stats person, it makes me so angry. Like I just had to stop reading stuff. It's like, I'm just so angry about how you're abusing this stuff. And so I want to take people back to like, let's assume, let's rewind 1,000 years, just 1,000 years. And like, what was available to eat? And even if someone's like, hey, I believe like, I want to be a vegetarian or a vegan or something. I'm like, okay, fine. Just don't do it on junk food, right? Because again, it's not food. It's a product. it's designed to make you hungry and eat a lot. So, yeah. So I definitely think that run the thought experiment. Would this part of the plant want to be eaten or not? And if not, then maybe the plant is going to do something to protect itself. And maybe that doesn't like just straight up kill you right away, but those negative side effects will accumulate over time. I think oxalates is like one of the examples that people are talking about today, where like that stuff just kind of builds up in the body. Like you can handle it. It won't kill you, but it's going to make you feel horrible. And lectins, and yeah, it's a real mess.
Yeah. I think we can agree on that. Unfortunately, I don't tend to. I'm one of these people. I'm definitely not the canary in the coal mine. I can accumulate a lot of shit, and I don't notice anything. But I have a feeling that down the line, I probably will.
Yeah.
But that's all really interesting. I'm also jumping back to your long story. I was just how long did it take you to, for the noise level to go down after you swapped diet? Was that pretty much instant for you, or did it kind of gradually go down? Or
it's a week.
A week.
Yeah. So that's that, and I'm sure it's like it drops like throughout the week. But yeah, after a week, I'm like, wow, felt a noticeable difference.
Yeah.
In how I felt, and again, that noise level that was in my head. And anyone who's struggled with addiction, I think they'll get the idea of the analogy of like that noise in the head, that constant like hum, that constant buzz in the back of your head, saying like, oh, I could go do that. Well, I could go do that. I could go do that. And it was so bad where I was just afraid to be alone in my own house for fear of like, oh yeah, I'm totally going to go binge on something, whether it's food or on the internet or with alcohol, because that buzz was so loud and so constant. And so when that noise level, that buzz came down, it was just like, like this feeling of relief. It's just like, this is amazing to not have that constant noise in the head.
And you don't know that feeling until you experienced it.
Oh yeah.
You can't describe it to someone, but when that noise is gone, it's like a whole new world is opening up, and you actually have a life and a will of your own to do whatever you want to do.
Yeah. Oh yeah, no worries. And the way I describe to people like is like, imagine you have an itch and you can't reach it and you can't scratch it, and it never goes away. Like, how maddening would that be? Right? That's what it feels like. Now, what happens is eventually, like, so let's say like you got some itch on your back, like you can kind of like ignore that for a while, but if it doesn't go away, eventually you're going to go and you're going to get something and you're going to scratch your back or something, because it's just like driving you insane. So when we tell someone who's struggling with addiction, hey, just stop. Just stop. That would be the equivalent of me telling that person with the itch, like, that itch is never going to go away and you're not allowed to do anything about it. And shame on you if you do.
Yeah.
It's like, that is absurd. That is insanity. So that's why I got so excited when I went on carnivore, and like that noise level came down, like the itch went away. What? This is crazy. But it feels so good. Oh my gosh.
Still, your brain is going to try for quite some time and say, hey, do you remember? That was pretty good. You should probably try it again.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so I'm not saying it was like, oh yeah, it stopped and like nothing ever happened again, because you'll still have, like, for me, like I'll still have situations in my life where like, oh my gosh, that was so stressful, or I'm so frustrated. It just takes so much more to get that dial to go back up, right? It's not like a hairpin trigger where before just kind of like anything and just like, it's like stuff in life has got to be pretty effed up for a really long time before that noise level goes up pretty dramatically. And what I'm working on now, and like what I'm working on with my wife, is we have these kind of healthy discussions about like, hey, how are we going to manage life well because the world's pretty effed up right now. It's like, hey, exercise is this amazing way to get that stress out. And again, having quality conversations with my wife where I talk to her about like, this is what I'm frustrated about. This is what's going on in my head, and just being open with her. So again, this idea of community, I'm connecting with someone, I'm having a healthy relationship. I'm able to express how I feel without being judged, which is a huge deal. And so if someone doesn't have that in their life, find it, do whatever you can. Like I said, I'm very blessed to have a really incredible wife, but before it was like, a men's recovery group where like we would go and share our struggles. And what was so powerful about that is like when you came into that group, I'm not sure how other recovery groups are, but with this one, the way it worked is when a new guy joined, all the guys who had been there would share their stories. And then the new guy would then share their story. And so what that does is it just kind of equalizes everyone. Like, hey, none of us are putting on airs. Like, we're all screwed up. We all want to get healthy. And so there's going to be no judgment here. Like, if you go off the rails, like, hey, we're going to hold you accountable in love because we care about you and we want better for you. But we're not going to be like, Dave, I cannot believe you did that. And it's kind of like, no, I totally believe you did that because I've done something exactly like that and about twice as bad. And so it's helping to deal with, built up shame. If someone has it, and like food is one, and the food is so rough because for two reasons. Our food environment creates addiction. So whenever I talk to someone, I say like, hey, this isn't your fault. The fact that you're struggling with your weight, the fact that you're struggling with food addiction is not your fault. You were put in an environment and not given information. Addiction is inevitable. It's the lucky few who don't get hit by that because genetically, they're resilient and, great, fantastic. But for the rest of us, addiction was inevitable. Like, our environment created that. Now, going forward, it's not our fault, but it is our problem, right? So you're the only one who's going to fix you. So I recognize that about myself. Like, hey, diet clearly makes a huge difference for me in my mental state. Being open and connected with my wife, having quality relationship is a huge component. Exercise is another huge component for me. So when I do have frustration and stress and things are banging on me, it's just like, okay, I have a way of expressing that energy in a healthy way. And I think that's one of the other things when I talk to people dealing with addiction, you need to put something else in place. So, because you can't just subtract something in your life without adding something. There's still 24 hours in a day. So if we take 2 hours out, what are you going to put in those 2 hours? You're not just going to sit there and not do something. And so I think that's one of the pieces I missed really early on, was just I don't want to do the bad thing. I don't want to do the bad thing. I'm like, okay, well, what good thing are you going to do in place of that? Because you still got to do something with that time. And I highly suggest not just sitting by yourself. Because again, the itch is going to get you. The itch wins.
Awesome. Right. So you mentioned community and that is a huge thing, but so much of our lives now, in front of computers, and especially now when in lockdown, or a lot of the world is anyway. So do you think that an online community could help in some way, or does it have to be in the flesh?
Oh man, great question. So I think this, and man, I'm gonna unpack this because I have some learnings from my own life.
Go on.
So the ideal is an in-person relationship, right? So some community around you. That's the ideal. Not possible right now. And so in the absence of that, online community is critical. And I was on Instagram and posting and stuff, and I liked seeing other people's stuff, and it was encouraging, but it wasn't we're having a really quality conversation right now. It wasn't that. And I feel a lot of the time social media is just kind of spewing into the void.
Yeah.
Great. And I'm very grateful for all the people putting out really fantastic content. So this isn't me telling you to stop. It's part of the reason like I don't post, because like I have nothing to add. Like all the good information is already out there. So I'm not just going to add to the noise. So when COVID-19 came, part of the reason I went off of carnivore is because I was the only one that I knew, like physically around me. So I had no like other person that I could talk to about carnivore. My wife's not carnivore. And she's just one of those people, you know, who can just kind of eat whatever and just like, it doesn't affect her. I'm like, oh, I love you, but I also hate you a little bit. But, so, but that's one of the reasons I stopped doing it, is because COVID-19 hit, you know, beef's all gone. And I'm just kind of like, whatever. Like, and I didn't realize like how good I had felt for how long. And I forget like, oh yeah, that felt really terrible. And so I think if there had been some type of online community where we were having like Zoom calls or something like that, and I think MeetRx is doing this now. So I've been kind of thinking like, do I need to sign up for that? Because it's one thing to watch the videos and listen to the podcast, but it's a whole nother thing when you're actually talking to someone else and who's doing the same thing you're doing and having those cheerleaders. And so I think that is critical. Clearly, because I didn't.
Yeah.
And that's when I'm like, you know, like I'm the only one. And so like, I feel like I'm an imposition sometimes, but yeah, I think if I had that community, it would have been much easier to say like, okay, well, I guess I'm doing pork for a while. I really don't like pork, except for bacon, totally different category. So I think that community of some kind is critical. Yeah. In face-to-face is ideal, but if online is the best you got, and this is what's great about the world now, is like, yeah, there's carnivores all over the world. So even if there's not one like down the street from you, there's a whole host of them online. And so that is fantastic. So yeah, I've been thinking about, I guess, joining the MeetRx one just so I have people to talk to.
Yeah. Good. Okay. So another thing that you kind of touched a little bit on. So maybe it was actually a couple of months ago, I put a poll out on Twitter actually asking people if they thought that, you know, obsessive eating or food addictions, if it was just a matter of willpower. And surprisingly, I got a 50-50 answer. There wasn't a lot of people answering that question, but I was a bit surprised that so many people thought that is down to willpower, because that is not my belief. So just wondering, you know, what's your take on that?
Okay. Let's set some stuff straight. Okay. That is malarkey, which is a polite way of saying bull poop. No. And again, I'm going to go back to, you know, referencing my life. So I'm 16 years old and I'm 265 pounds at this point, right? Huge kid. Again, sorry for the English units.
That's all right.
Yeah, huge kid. And I've been doing musical theater all growing up. And I was going to go into my senior year. We were going to do a musical at high school. Sorry. We're going to be doing this musical. I wanted the lead part. Right. And I was talking to the director about this. And the director just straight up told me, like, Matthew, I cannot cast you as a lead. You are too fat. It's a pretty rough thing to say to a high school kid, but he wasn't wrong. And I was like, fine, I'll show you. Right. So let's keep this in mind. I had wanted to lose weight for years at this point and just felt completely incapable. So I'm like, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to eat less, move more. Right. And so I then proceed to run 4 to 8 miles every day for 9 months.
Holy shit.
On hills. Right. This is not flat. This is hills. It was rough, but I lost weight, lost 85 pounds. Right. So you're telling me that the same kid, like for years, who's like wanted to lose weight, oh, it's just a matter of willpower, but like, okay, I got like like, oh, you didn't have enough motivation or whatever. I'm just like, no, like I had it because I could clearly demonstrate it. And then in the winter when it was dark, I would just do stair steps for 45 minutes because I couldn't run outside because it was cold and raining. So clearly I had like willpower within me. What was also interesting, I changed what I was eating and was very strict about it. And so someone might say like, Matthew, you're making my case. Like you suddenly had, but I'm like, you had the willpower, like you just had the willpower to like eat right and exercise. And what I want to point out is like my diet changed, right? When I was eating garbage foods and I wanted to lose weight, I could not restrict how much I ate. When I switched to healthier foods, I'm suddenly able to regulate how much I eat. Right. And I still have access to as much food as I want. But all of a sudden, the amount that I'm eating has gone down. And yeah, I'm exercising more, which a lot more, which is great. But like the thing I wanted to point out there, like I had tried for years eating what I had been eating and just eating less of it to try to lose weight. Didn't work. The moment I changed what I'm eating to broccoli and rice and chicken breast and that type of stuff, I suddenly now have the willpower to like eat less. Like I'm the same kid. Like nothing else about me has changed, but like suddenly I shifted the food and suddenly got better. And so this is where, and yeah, I'm going for like a terrible diet to like a less terrible diet, but clearly like there was a shift that happened with my food. And so this is why I'm like, hey, if that shift caused that much of a difference, maybe a further shift, like all the way to carnivore, which is kind of like the most extreme, would cause an even greater shift in your mental state and therefore your ability to make good and healthy decisions. And so, yeah, I absolutely think that is malarkey. I think, and let me be more specific. If you're just talking about like the willpower to eat less, like hunger always wins. Hunger always wins because your body is like, I need nutrition. I need calories. You're not giving it to me. Typically calories isn't the issue. Typically it's the nutrition. You're not getting the micronutrients, the amino acids, the other things that your body needs to sustain itself. So it's like, you're hungry. You have enough calories, but you don't have enough nutrition. Hunger always wins. So if someone's talking about like, oh, you just need self-control to choose healthier foods. Okay. I can kind of get more on board with that. But again, if your strategy depends on self-control, you're going to lose because eventually there's going to be something in your life that is going to be disruptive enough. And you're like, oh my gosh, I just need that chocolate, or I just need that something. And then down the well you go. The best strategy I know of for eating healthy is to not have unhealthy food around. Like take willpower out of the equation, like remove it as a factor, only have healthy stuff around you. I can't do that right now because again, I live in a household with other people who eat other things.
Yeah.
But I know that if I focus my self-control on just letting myself eat as much of the healthy stuff as I want, steak, eggs, quantity takes care of itself.
Yeah.
Like I don't think at all about how much I eat. I just think about what I eat and I let myself have as much of that as I want. And when I do that, I'm not hungry for anything else.
That's so awesome.
Does that answer your question, or am I like going all over?
Yeah, I absolutely think that you did answer that question. I think we can say that it's not down to willpower, but the willpower might be affected by your diet. If we want to go that way.
Yeah. Well, I think what we're finding is a lot of the order of things we're finding that it's backwards a lot of the time,
Yeah.
where it's like, if you fix the food, a lot of other things just fix themselves,
Yeah.
because you got like the driving force, you fix that, other things are going to fix themselves. And that is, again, that's why I get so excited about carnivore, because of the ramifications when it comes to dealing with addiction. If I deal with that, it has this cascading effect of making everything better.
Yeah. So before you found carnivore, did you try a lot of other things to get rid of your addictions?
Yeah. So again, like, let's talk about like the willpower thing. Like, there's the classic grit your teeth, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
That can confirm that does not work.
No.
I would be in recovery groups. I had a group of guys that I was always very open with about whatever it is I was struggling with. Again, helpful in a emotional sense, but not helpful in a, hey, I stopped doing the thing I want to stop doing sense, which is kind of the point. I had done other diets, but for the purpose of losing weight. Diet was never like, oh, I want to improve my struggle with addiction. I'm going to try a different diet. That was purely for aesthetics, right?
Yeah.
So I did paleo for a while. I kind of did like the classic thing where it's like, oh, I discovered paleo. I'm like, oh, this is awesome. And then I did more research. I'm like, well, this isn't all like, not a lot of you are like consistent, because like rice is only available in a very small part of the world. So like, this doesn't make sense to me. So the engineer in me kept wanting to dig in, eventually found my way to keto, did keto for a while, which is great because I wasn't gaining weight, but I wasn't losing weight. So I kept searching. And then kind of, kept going until I got to carnivore, which I think is a really classic sequence that people go through.
Okay. So let's talk about the different addictions. So for me, I only have sugar addiction. I've never been tempted by anything else on this planet, and I don't think that's going to happen. It's just anything that is sweet. I mean, give me a bag of brown sugar and I can eat it with a spoon, not so much the white one, but it's to that level. If it's sweet, it works. So, but you have had food addiction, you have porn addiction, alcohol addiction.
Oh yeah.
But food addiction is one of those things that is kind of, it's socially acceptable and encouraged, I would say. So, it's your birthday, you have to have cake. No, I don't eat cake. What? How can you not? It's your birthday. You really should have it because it means that you have to enjoy yourself. Whereas alcohol can be one of these things that, when you go overboard, people can be a little bit, oh, he can't handle it or she can't handle it.
Yeah.
And porn is almost like we don't really talk about that because that's very, you don't want to be the weird guy and talk about that.
Yep.
So does that, the social thing, do you think that has influenced the degree to which you have those addictions or how easily you've gotten rid of it, etc.? If we can compare the three, because I think they're all in a different category. I don't know if what I'm saying is making sense.
Yeah, no, certainly. I think that, it's interesting because, so food addiction is a rough one because it's one of those that if you're dealing with it, you can't really hide it, right? Because you're fat. You're fat, and I was fat, and so shame. I think shame is a huge driver of addiction. So when you feel shame, it drives you to that even more because you don't want to feel bad. And addiction is often a means of dealing with, dealing with bad feelings.
Yep.
So what makes food addiction, sugar addiction, so painful is that the addiction itself creates the conditions to drive more addiction. Like not only are you addicted to that sweet feeling, but you constantly feel ashamed for being, the big guy, being too heavy. And like, man, like, why are you taking up so much space? And what's even more insidious is that the advice that you're typically given to deal with it is pretty much the exact opposite of what you should do in terms of like what foods you should be eating. So it's one of those super horrible addictions. And yeah, it's weird because there's so many social norms that make it happen, right? Like you talked about, like, oh, your birthday, you need to have cake. I have a tough time with marketing people because they create want, like their entire job is to create dissatisfaction. And when we turned food into a product to sell and not something for just like nourishing the body, we started down a very ugly road. And so I see it. I honestly think that one, I think the food one is the hardest one to deal with because you can't escape it. You can't just say like, well, I'm just going to stop eating.
Yeah.
Well, okay, you can do that for a few days, but you're going to have to eat again. And so if I have to like tick any one of those, it's like, hey, which is the hardest one to deal with? Food, by far, easily, because there's the most landmines. Like it's just going through your day. Like any office event, like not that we're having a lot of office events these days, but like people bring cupcakes or people bring treats or something like that. And so I think that one is actually the most difficult. Alcohol is another interesting one because depending on what culture you're in, there's different levels of exposure to it. Like if you grew up in like, there are some families, that just don't have alcohol. And so like your social group may be made up of people who don't drink. And so then it's relatively easy. But then there are other people like the rest of the world, like we really glamorize alcohol. Like if you like, oh yeah, like we are going down to the bar, we're hanging and stuff. And like so much of these things are about having a good time and like wanting to connect socially. And what I found with alcohol, and one of the reasons that I would drink is because it makes being social easier, right? And what I didn't recognize, like, hey, I need to become more okay with who I am and better at just relating with people and being open with them and not needing alcohol to kind of ease that, right? And so since we glamorize it so much as a culture, it's like, well, this is what the cool people do. I'm just like, yeah, again, it's like that there's a lot of social expectations there. So I would say that what's nice, I'm putting big air quotes around that, it's like someone who's dealing with alcohol addiction, is because people get that.
Yeah.
Like, hey, they see how destructive it can be. And so if you're saying like, hey, I'm not having alcohol, people will get that and they'll respect that. They'll respect that boundary.
Yeah.
Right. If you have good friends, if you have crappy friends who are pushing you to drink, you don't actually have friends. You have people you hang out with. Like, because your friend is going to want you to do what's best for you. Pornography is really another really insidious one. And I know people are all over the gamut. Like, hey, is it okay? Is it not okay? Cool. I'm more concerned with like, is there a thing in your life that is destroying you? Is it keeping you from being able to connect with other people? And pornography was definitely in that category for me, where it's just kind of like, this is soaking up more time than I want to give it, which is 0. And it's damaging my relationships with other people. It damages my relationship with my wife. So it's extremely damaging. But we, as a culture, kind of just do like a wink, wink, nudge, nudge, and just like, yeah, whatever. It's like, oh, it's not that big of a deal. And like, we just don't talk about it. And then again, there's like this weird glamorization that kind of happens like in movies, like, oh, guys are going down to the strip club or whatever. And it totally misrepresents like what that world is like, right? And it creates, and there's also, so it's also much more damaging for, so I'm a dude, and so like everything I'm saying is kind of coming from that perspective as a male, but like the male brain, when it's developing and it gets exposed to pornography, it kind of sets this bar for like expectations of like what is sex going to be like, what should be enticing, what is beauty, and just completely distorts norms, right? So like it's just like your ability to like even perceive, like be aroused is damaged by looking at pornography because your norm is just way off of base, right? There's nothing like in pornography, like none of that is real, but like that's what your brain gets exposed to, so that's what it expects. Funny enough, same with food. We have these food products, these manufactured food products, which are way sweeter than anything that occurs in nature, way more saturated fat. Well, I mean, not bad math and saturated fat, but like that thing is a manufactured thing. That's not what normal food should taste like. And we are exposing our brain or exposing our bodies and our brains to something so much stronger than what it was ever intended to deal with. And so you get like, oh my gosh, like that felt amazing. I want some more of that. So I think there's a real similarity there. And again, same with alcohol. You know, alcohol causes a huge rush of dopamine, and it's very efficient at giving you a dopamine high, much easier than going out and exercising. Like and so it's kind of short circuiting these mechanisms. Like you're supposed to have to work for like the way like those hormones work to like drive you toward positive behaviors and deter you from bad behaviors. You break those mechanisms when you go around them with highly processed foods, alcohol, and pornography. They're all essentially doing the same thing. They're messing with the reward centers of your brain and giving it a way stronger signal than you would normally get. What ends up happening though is you adapt. It blunts the response, so then you need something stronger. So you need to escalate. So you need to escalate. So you need to escalate. And then at some point, like you're a total mess and you feel completely out of control. Where I think carnivore comes in is it's so simple. Mm-hmm. It's really hard to screw up. People will find a way. But I mean, it's like if you just take it back to like the super basics: ruminated meat, salt, water, right? Done. And that is so nutritious and satisfying that if you're able to like stick with it for, let's say, a week, your body is able to start to correct that damage. And again, it's not like, oh yeah, I went on carnivore and like everything was like, you know, bunnies and rainbows and butterflies, but the struggle to do the right thing became much less. And so doing the right thing, making healthy decisions became much easier. I realize I kind of went all over the place on that.
That's fine.
Yeah.
I'm kind of just enjoying listening to the stories. It's all good.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that.
So I know we've been doing this for a little bit more than an hour now. So I have one more question for you. And that would be like, what advice would you give to someone who's already on a carnivore diet, but they feel like they're addicted to maybe sugar, maybe cheese, coffee, you know, alcohol is probably quite common as well, or you know, even porn. It's just that people don't tell me about it. I don't know. What would you tell them? What can you do?
Yeah, great question. So first thing every time is going to be community. Do you have someone in your life that you trust that you can talk to about what's going on? I know not everyone has that luxury. That is tough. And so at the very least, get into some kind of community where you're connecting with people so that you don't feel isolated. Again, ideally someone that you can talk to about what you're struggling with. With the age of the internet and us being all stuck at home because of COVID-19, depending on where you live, some countries are opening up. likely there is a group that exists that you could connect with online. And so like, yeah, maybe it's not face to face, but you could connect with somebody and talk about what you're struggling with. So community is always going to be number one. Second thing, do everything you can to get the temptation just out of your life, right? So that can be a little tough depending on your situation, but like if it's alcohol, like get the alcohol out of your house. Why do you need alcohol in your house? You don't. Including the cooking sherry, throw that stuff out. It's terrible anyway. So get it out of your house, get it out of your life as much as you possibly can. And if you say like, well, I need this around, I'm like, okay, life is I'm going to like sit you down like, okay, let's be real with you. Life is very short. You really want to waste your life and on dickering around with this and not taking it seriously? Get it out of your life. Again, that's tough because if like you have someone who's dealing with like a pornography addiction and like we're all working remotely, like I can't get rid of the internet. I'm like, okay, yeah, that's fair. Like again, so like, are you going to bed at a good time? Right? When do you struggle during the day? Okay, I know that if I stay up past 10 p.m., like that's going to be a bad time. Okay, go to bed at 10 p.m. Like arrange your life to get those things out. And then the last thing I would say is, if you're struggling, you've connected with community, you've gotten it out of your life. I'd also say like, be patient with yourself. Like be gracious with yourself, right? And being gracious does not mean just saying like, oh, it's just one more time. It's like, no, you can be tough and gracious on yourself. Like, forgive yourself, talk to somebody like, hey, I screwed up again. Keep going forward because, okay, maybe it's like, okay, maybe you made it a week. Okay. Now let's make it 8 days. Let's make it 9 days. Let's make it 10 days. So like, don't think about like, oh my gosh, I'm never going to be able to do this again for like the rest of my life. Like, don't think about that. Just like get through today. Just get through today. And again, you get through enough todays, you end up getting a year. You get some more todays, you stack those up, you got a decade. But don't ever think about like how long this is going to be. And probably the other thing is do not jump to intermittent fasting or OMAD or any of that stuff. So one of the things that I did early on is like, when I go in on something, I go nuts, right? I go all the way. So I'm like, oh, I'm going to go carnivore and I'm going to do OMAD and I'm going to work out 30 times a day. And, just ridiculous, right? And just kind of like ease into it. So if you're on carnivore and you're wanting to like drop coffee is a great example. Like put something else there to take the place of coffee. I love warm broth, like bone broth with some salt in it. I find is like warm and it gives me that soothing ritual in the morning. I do still have coffee. I just don't have nearly as much because it really affects me. But find something to put in place and like ease into it. Don't feel like you have to go whole hog. I do not restrict how much I eat. And right now I'm not forcing when I eat. When I did it the first time, I'm like, I'm going to do OMAD and I'm going to eat at 3 p.m. or I'm going to like eat at a particular time. That's dumb. If you get hungry, eat. And this is specifically talking to someone who's like dealing with an addiction and trying to get off of that, right? You only have so much willpower. Don't waste it on being really neurotic about when you eat and that kind of stuff. Like let yourself have as much of that healthy, nutritious food as you want so that you're not wasting energy on like sticking to a strict 16-8 or OMAD or something like that. This time I said, when I went back to carnivore again, I said like before I was like, I always want to eat as late in the day as I possibly can. And I would push it till I was like really hungry. Now what I do is I just have one big meal in the morning, like at 9 or 10 a.m. because that's when I got hungry. I had a huge meal and then I didn't feel hungry the rest of the day. And so OMAD was a cinch. But if I like waited and got hungry, then it was much more difficult. So community, get it out of your life, put something else in that place, and be purposeful about what changes you're making in your life, and don't do too many at once.
Boom.
And be gracious with yourself. Be gracious with yourself. It takes time.
Yeah. I mean, part of the healing from any addiction is that we will fall off that wagon at some point and then come back again. So
yep,
you just have to expect that to happen. Not encouraging it or saying that, you know, use that as an excuse, but you know, it probably will happen. And if it doesn't, let me know, because I haven't met anyone so far that haven't had some sort of falling off along the way.
Yeah. Yep. And that's okay. We're growing as people. You're always growing.
As long as you know what you're doing, you kind of pay attention to what actually happened, analyze it a little bit, see, okay, how can I prevent this in the future? Are we good?
And that's where the real value of community comes in, because if you have someone that is a confidant, you can say like, hey, I screwed up. And that's what this men's recovery group was so valuable for, because we would say like, hey, I screwed up. And then what would happen is we would unpack that.
Awesome.
Okay, what got you there? Right. And it's going through that, like being vulnerable, being open, and unpacking that garbage to figure out like, hey, how let's notice some patterns that are happening. Let's find out why those patterns do what they do. And now let's put something else in place that is a healthy response to those things, so that we end up in a different place.
That's awesome. I like that. Right. So anything else that you want to mention? Any final words of wisdom? Something?
No. Yeah, I don't think I have any final words of wisdom. The only thing I would say is, like, again, community.
Yeah.
Community. And that was for me what the big struggle was, and why I went off carnivore during the COVID-19 is because I had that lack of community. And so that's what I'm working on now. We actually moved back home, so I had more back to Portland, Oregon, which is where I'm from originally. So I have more community around me, but I want to be connecting with the carnivore community and not just posting on Instagram, which is great and inspiring. So keep doing that, y'all. But there's a real difference. There's a real different nourishing of the soul that happens when people come together and share their stories and encourage one another. And carnivore is hard, not because eating meat is hard, but because our world is not super down with that. And so if you have a community that you can connect with, it's going to make that a lot easier.
Awesome. Okay, so you mentioned that you're on Twitter. Are you anywhere else if someone wants?
No, I'm just on Twitter right now. It's just Carnivore Cruise. I had Instagram, but again, I just found that I was just like scrolling. I'm like, this is not adding a whole lot of value to my life. And so if people want to reach out to me, that's the place to do it. Again, I don't post much because there's a lot of great stuff already being said, so I'm not going to dilute that. But I'm happy to ask questions or, have a conversation. And that's why I left it, is because, like, hey, I want to be available for people to connect with me.
Awesome. Thank you so much for coming on. It was really, really insightful and interesting to hear what you had to say.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.